The Thirsty Owl, a Badger Stevens saga of blood, revenge, hope, humor, and discovery by Nick Garcia. Brought to you by We Are the Television. Badger Stevens was an old grouch. How could you blame him, though? After so many adventures across the open seas, getting a desk job kills a man. Badger used to be a pirate, or maybe he still was. He had lived for so long, there were some that thought he was even immortal. He was an old fool now, tall and lanky, slicked back hair, scar across his left eye. He said he got it in a knife fight while sailing the Black Sea. But most think he was a reckless drunk and was slashed across the face during a mugging gone wrong. Why can't both stories be true? Many of the people Badger had known were long gone. Badger claimed to have been over 300 years old, but judging from his driver's license, he was around 72 but looked 48. Many thought he suffered from a severe case of dementia. He told tall tales. He painted the most vivid illustrations that he claimed were all from memory. Badger had a collection of rare artifacts from all over the globe, but now he worked in sales. Pirates, immortal vampires, cosmic diners, these were things people didn't believe in. Badger knew the truth. He had been there. He was there when Alexander conquered the known world. He fought Blackbeard to a stalemate. He was even at the premiere of Avatar with James Cameron. Or so he claims. Now, Badger, or Stevens, as his boss would say, sold car insurance. Banks no longer took gold as currency. It was a changed world, and Stevens did not know how to be a part of it. Stevens would roll out of bed most days and inject himself with coffee. He would hide the scars of battle with a suit and tie and power up his Tesla and head to work. Not fitting in the world made him sour. It made him bitter. He would shake his fist violently on the road. He had a mouth of a sailor because he had been one. Badger Stevens was also a man of violence. He had a thirst for blood. He hated the homeless population, and in his spare time would add to his body count by draining the life from the streets. Many would go on to say that Badger Stevens was the most ruthless pirate in the cosmos. His bloodlust earned him the nickname the Badger. At work, he had other nicknames. Old Man Stevens. In the break room, he feasted on quail eggs and a sleeve of saltine crackers. People credited his extraordinary physique to the intake of water. At least 26 glasses of water a day, quail eggs, crackers, and water. He moved like a shark, but his sales skills moved like a snail. His supervisor, Winston, was half his age, and Stevens hated him. "One day I'll cut that man's face off and wear it like a mask," Stevens would say. The office would laugh. But Badger was skilled in the art of face removal. He had done it on numerous occasions. So he claimed. At the end of the day, he would clock out and head to his local watering hole, the Thirsty Owl. And it's here where our adventure begins. Badger Stevens knew how to drink. He knew how to drink pretty well, in fact. It was the one thing that brought him peace after a long day at the office. Well, drinking and slaughtering the homeless. You see, Badger hated the homeless for a thing done to him centuries ago. A tribe of nomadic homeless warriors massacred all of Badger's men in a night forever known as the Reckoning. Ever since that night, Badger vowed to rid the world of homeless people. But on this day, Badger didn't feel like killing. He only wanted to drink. You see, Badger had received a promotion. He was getting the title VP of Sales. This meant he was excelling at his job, a job he hated, a job he loathed. All the demon warrior wanted to do was drink. Little Pete, the owner of the Thirsty Owl, was a boy when Badger walked through the doors of the pub for the very first time. Covered in blood from a night of slaying the homeless, Badger pulled up a bar stool next to little Pete, who was maybe 5 at the time, and handed him a bloody dagger. Pete looked at the dagger, and then at Badger, and then back at the dagger. "Is this mine?" Pete said. "Fuck no," Badger said. "Go clean it off for me before I use it on you," Badger said. And thus a friendship was born. Little Pete, now in his mid-60s, knew Badger's drink order by heart. It had been the exact same since the day they met. A shot of whiskey, a cold beer, shot of whiskey, a beer, a gin and tonic, a cold beer, some hash, a little bump of Coke, another shot, another cold beer, and then to finish it off with an ice cold margarita. Always in that order. Nothing ever changed. Except for the night of the promotion. "Shot of whiskey coming right up, Badger," little Pete said. "Not tonight," Badger replied. Little Pete almost shit himself when he heard that. Pete ran to the bar door, flipped the sign from open to close, and shooed away the few people that were left inside. "This is the night," Pete said. "I knew it would come." Pete grabbed a dagger from under the counter, placed it on the bar top, and ripped open his shirt. "Make it quick," Pete said, "but make sure the family still recognizes me." "Jesus Christ, Pete, I'm not going to kill you. Got a promotion at work," Badger said. "Oh," Pete said. "That's what I get for jumping to conclusions." "It's just making me think about life. Am I doomed to be a salesman for life?" said Badger. "I was born for war. Now I push paper." "You know, things could be worse. You could run a failing bar," Pete said. "I suppose you're right," Badger said. "Owning a failing bar sounds terrible." But there was something else on Badger's mind. With his outlook on life slowly shifting, could people change? Did he have a bigger purpose than cleansing the world of the homeless population? Perhaps. But he would need to discover that one drink at a time. "I think I'll have a bottle of vodka to start the night, Pete," Badger said. "Let's mix it up." Hadrian was a ruthless pirate. He commanded a vessel known as the Black. With this skeleton crew, he waged a never-ending war across the seas. There were no better fighters, drinkers, thieves, assassins, or murderers than Hadrian and his men. At times, they were even hired as mercenaries. They turned the tides of war for a price. They were also a greedy bunch. The crew of the Black had an unquenchable thirst for slaughter. On one such occasion, they were paid a lump sum to assassinate a king, but instead wiped out his entire bloodline and the men who paid them. Hadrian had hair as white as snow. There wasn't a scar on him. He was clean shaven and spoke with an extensive vocabulary. His hair was shoulder length, always pulled up in a samurai bun or flowing down to his shoulders. He was tall. He was also very muscular, like he was carved out of stone. His men followed him without question. They took no prisoners and never lost in battle. Eventually, people began to think Hadrian of the Black was an immortal. Some said he drank the blood of his victims to remain youthful. No one ever knew how old he was, nor the age of his crew. They moved like a shadow across the sea, a black plague that had no cure. They were feared, and most of all, known for their bloodlust. One night, the Black was hired to exterminate an entire island population. Under the cover of darkness, Hadrian sent his best warriors to slaughter the population while he waited from the ship. When the deed was done, the men were ordered to extinguish their torches in return. One by one, the torches turned dark as the screams of the islanders were heard, all except one. As his men turned, a single torch remained lit on the island. Hadrian disembarked with his crew to find out why his warrior had disobeyed him. When he arrived in the home, Hadrian found his man lying at the foot of a boy holding a bloody dagger in one hand and an arm severed at the bone in the other. It looked like it had been chewed off by some beast. When the warlord entered, he found a boy swinging the arm like a club. Hadrian was shocked. No man was ever able to lay a finger on his soldiers, but before his eyes, a boy no taller than a cactus stood swinging an arm, ready to slay the next person that approached him. "Well, aren't you a fiery little badger?" Hadrian said. "You shall do nicely as part of our ranks. Plus, we are a man down." "Are we all in agreement?" Hadrian said. The crew nodded in silence. Hadrian picked up the dagger the man was holding, but before he could look at the boy, the child had leaped into the air, ready to bring down the arm of justice on Hadrian's head. With his quick reflexes, Hadrian made one quick slash with the dagger, connecting with the boy's face. "If you try that again, I'll end you," Hadrian said. "Not if I end you first," the boy replied. The crew and Hadrian exploded in laughter. "And that's the story on how I got this scar," Badger Stevens said to Pete. Pete had this tired look on his face. He had lost all the color and appeared like a ghost. "Pete, snap out of it," Badger said. But Pete was silent. Badger was almost done with his bottle of vodka. "I think I need a cold beer," he said. "The winds of death are returning to me. I think I'll do some hunting tonight," he said. As Badger Stevens exited the Thirsty Owl, it started to rain. It had to be around 2 a.m. Badger looked up at the sky and let the droplets of rain hit his face. He took a deep breath. Badger knew he had too much to drink, but the fever was in him, and the only thing that could cure it, the fever, as he referred to it, was a feeling created over time. It was a dark cloud that gnawed on his spine, in his mind, and wrapped itself around his throat like a python. Badger knew the only way to cure the fever was through slaughter. Hadrian taught him that. Badger opened the trunk of his car and retrieved his prized possession, his weapon of choice, a weapon he had mastered over centuries. They were a pair of Kamrabi knives. They were small Indonesian curved knives that resembled claws, much like a raptor or even a badger. With these tools, Badger Stevens had become one of the most ruthless warriors on the planet. Hundreds of thousands of men died at the hands of these daggers, including Hadrian of the Black. But tonight was about working on himself. The work promotion had really done a number on Badger. He took one last sip of his beer, tossed it in the streets, and set out for his favorite homeless encampment to do the Lord's work. Centuries ago, Badger could slave 3,000-4,000 men in a single night. Now, in his depressed state, he could only finish off around 200 to 300. He crossed the street and headed into the nearby alley. After walking for a bit, he came across a woman peering into the trash can. "Excuse me, sir. I seem to have accidentally tossed my light bill away. Could you be a gent and hold this lid up?" she said. "Not tonight, lady," Badger replied, and with two quick motions, Badger had turned her inside out. He continued on his way. The first one is always the hardest, he thought. These homeless leeches, I hate every last one of them. Badger's fury could not be matched, which is what made him so ruthless in life and on sales calls. Further down the alley, he came across a group of strangers laughing. Badger thought, why would a group of men be walking so happily in the alley at night? With a round sphere in their hands, they are probably celebrating a recent massacre, he thought. Not tonight, Badger said. In a flash, Badger leaped from the shadows, catching the youths off guard. The first strike of his blade nearly beheaded the first man. With his arms extended, Badger sliced the second and third men from belly to throat. The last man could barely get out a single word before Badger sank his daggers into the man's chest, taking him to the ground. Now these men will never harm another soul, Badger said. After a bit more walking, Badger finally arrived at 3 homeless encampments. He had been here before, years ago. Under the cover of night, he executed the entire population, 88 souls in total, freeing the world from their evil deeds. Nothing had changed. Badger slipped in the back and went to work. In an hour's time, all 56 individuals were dead. No sound, no screams, just silent death. The fever was gone. Badger knew he could sleep soundly tonight. Luckily, his boss had given him the day off so he could celebrate. When Badger got home, he burnt his clothes, a traditional warrior's custom, washing his weapon, and prayed to his god, and slept. But as Badger slept, his TV stayed on. Around 6 a.m., the morning news began with a breaking story. The headline read, "Canaryville Ripper strikes again. 56 slain in gruesome fashion at the site of a previous massacre 40 years to the date." Detective H.S. Towers had been on the force for almost 30 years. His family immigrated from India when he was just a boy. He grew up on the streets of Tulsa, Oklahoma. They shaped him, as they do every man. Towers was as mean as they came, a real piece of shit. He was always willing to break the law to find justice. A couple of years back, he was called to the scene of the first homeless shelter massacre. He was just a simple beat cop back then, but you never forget such a deadly scene. 88 souls were taken that night. Their bodies were chopped into pieces. Dicks were chopped off and shoved in the asses. Little kids were out cut in half, and women were unrecognizable. A body count like that had never been seen before. The case remained unsolved due to the lack of evidence. Not a single fingerprint, hair sample, footprint, nothing was found at the scene. It was as if the people slaughtered each other. Towers was assigned the worst part. He had to go and match all the dicks with their original owners. Imagine grabbing limp peckers in your hand, all bloody and soft, and having to match them with their owners. It took Towers a little over 4 days to finish the job, and he never got the smell of bloody wieners from leaving his mind. That night shaped Towers for good. He vowed to bring the killer to justice by any means necessary. Walking through the halls with his leather jacket, aviator shades, his turban, toothpick hanging, mug of coffee, Towers instantly knew this was the work of his arch enemy, the Canaryville Ripper. "God damn, it smells a little bloody dicks in here," Towers said. "Where is my forensic unit?" "Over here, sir," a voice shouted from down the hall. Towers walked over a body after body after body till he reached the end of the hallway where the officer was crouching down over a dead corpse. "Move aside," Towers said. "My God, dicks and assholes. It's him, all right. He's back," Towers said. "Alert the media. I want this entire place roped off in 5-block radius. He had to have left a fingerprint somewhere, and I want you to find it," Towers shouted. "But, sir," the officer said, "we already searched the entire place. There is nothing." Towers turned and began walking away. "I guess I'm going to have to do it the hard way and start cracking some skulls," he said. Back at the station, Towers dug out his old files and pinned up his leads on the board. All he had was a picture of Dracula, a limp dick, and a homeless man. What's the connection, he thought. What am I missing? Towers knew his reputation was at stake. He had failed to solve the case 30 years ago. The killer's identity haunted him, and now he was back. This son of a bitch is trying to tell me something, Towers thought. Towers reached into his desk and pulled out a flask of the finest goat's milk in Oklahoma. He took a sip, then wiped his mouth. "Now that's the stuff," he said. He knew his work wasn't done. Towers would never stop hunting down the evil that slaughtered in the night. The case was reopened, and he would go to hell in order to find justice. Badger Stevens wakes up the same way every man does, with a hellish nightmare. After a night of slaughter, Badger was still feeling like life had no purpose. He showered, got dressed, snacked on some quail eggs. He burned his toast, blackened his coffee, sharpened his daggers. Badger was already late for work, but he didn't care. He hopped in his car and drove down the road to the Thirsty Owl for a morning drink. "Pete, it's me. Open up," Badger said as he banged on the front door. A window opened up overhead and a small little head popped out. "Christ, Badger, it's 7:30 in the morning," Pete replied. "I know, but I need a drink. Now come open up before I kill your entire family." "I know you're joking," Pete said, "but I'm gonna come down anyways." In a few minutes, the door clicked open and Badger pulled up his regular stool. Pete remained in his jammies as he poured Badger a shot of whiskey. "It seems to be the problem, mate," Pete said. "I don't know, Pete," Badger replied. "I did some killing last night thinking it would get me out of this funk, but it didn't." "How much killing did you do?" Pete said, grinning through his teeth. "It's hard to keep track these days, old friend," Badger replied. Badger tossed back his shot and signaled for another round. He had the blues and didn't know how to shake 'em. "What if you just quit your job?" Pete said. "I don't know, Pete. In this economy?" Badger tossed back the next shot, and then the next, and then four more. By now, it was almost 8 a.m. He was an hour late for work. "Maybe what you need is a therapist," Pete said. "A what?" Badger replied. "You know, a trusted ally that listens to your problems and gives you advice. Isn't that what you do, Pete?" "I suppose you're right." "What if you just kill your boss?" Pete said jokingly. "You know, I don't kill the innocent people, Pete, only those who deserve death." Badger finished his last drink and told Pete he would see him later this evening. He made his way to the office and parked in his usual spot. He walked through the office hall and listened to the joy and cheers from his coworkers as they shouted his name. "Stevens is here! Congratulations on the promotion!" everyone shouted. Winston strolled up to his desk. "You're late," he said. "I'm kidding. You are the boss now. I suppose you can arrive when you damn well please." "Fuck off, Winston," Badger said. "I'm not in the mood." "As you wish, boss," Winston said. "But remember, we have that big meeting with corporate coming up." The second thing old man Stevens hated more than homeless was corporate. Stevens hated being a slave to the man. He was a slave once and knew the chains of bondage and vowed to never return. But here he was. There had to be a way to break the cycle he was in. He had fought demons and pirates. He had fought land giants, whales, flown with eagles, visited the deepest regions of space, but yet he couldn't defeat corporate America? If he couldn't do that, was he even a warrior? "Tell them I'll be there," Stevens said. Winston strolled off, leaving Stevens to his thoughts. There has to be something I can do to defeat this blood-sucking leech. Someone who has the answer. All of a sudden, he knew what he had to do. Hadrian of the Black, his old captor. He would have the answer. The only thing was, he had been dead for over 300 years. Badgers opened his desk, rifled through his papers, and pulled out an ancient book. The Book of the Dead, or How to Use Necromancy. "This should certainly come in handy," he said. Towers was still stewing away on the idea that the killer was some type of mythological creature. It had to be. No man slaughters so many without leaving a single piece of DNA. Could the killer be a werewolf? Perhaps even a vampire? Maybe it was something not of this earth. His theories, nonetheless, were all shut down by higher-ups. He was a fool to think otherwise. Towers grabbed his coat, sunglasses, and a fresh cigarette and hopped on his bike and left the station. He needed to clear his head. He needed to go to the one place he knew he would not be bothered. Towers strolled into the Thirsty Owl around 6 p.m. It was a Monday. The place had 7 or 8 other occupants. It smelt of old, dirty sink water. Towers inhaled deeply, then sat down at the far end of the bar. "How's it hanging, Pete?" Towers said. Oh, just a bunch of the same, Pete replied. Just how I like it, said Towers. The usual? Make it a double. You got it, officer. Pete went behind the bar and poured Towers a nice frothy glass of milk. Goat's milk, to be exact. Due to Towers' strict religion, he did not drink, but the guy loved to do hard drugs. Before Pete could return, Towers already had a couple lines of the finest white china poured out on the table. You gonna partake in this, Pete, or, be a little bitch? Sure, why not, Pete said. Pete, let me ask you something, Towers said. What's that? Have you seen Badger lately? I'm having a hard time with a case and I could really use his eyes. Yeah, he said he would stop by after work. All that bastard does is work, Towers said. Towers tossed back the cold glass of milk and took another bump of the white china. So what's the case this time? Pete asked. Canaryville Ripper is back. Slaughtered a whole bunch over on 63rd. Those poor bastards, Pete said. Well, good luck canvassing the night. Thanks, Pete. You're good people, Towers said. Pete went back to doing his duties as Towers stayed, doing line after line after line. It was almost midnight, and Badger had yet to show. It wasn't like him, and Towers knew it. Any time Badger said he would be somewhere, he was, no matter the place. Badger never missed a date. Are you absolutely sure he was coming tonight, Pete? That's what he said. He was here this morning. Maybe I should swing by his house and check in on him. That might be a good idea, Pete said. He recently was promoted at work and has his mind turned into scrambled eggs. They gave him the VP job, Towers said. They sure did, said Pete. Fucking idiots. Badger might kill them all because of that. But he won't. I've never seen that man hurt a fly. But he damn sure looks like he can rip the head off a 500-pound marlin, that's for sure, Towers said. I'll go check on him. Thanks for the milk and drugs, Pete. Any time, officer. Towers hopped on his bike, lit a cigarette, and headed towards Badger's compound. Little did he know that at that very moment, Badger was busy trying to fix his life. Badger knew what was missing. It wasn't the laughter, glory, or the absence of death. What was missing was the challenge. The only man capable of being Badger's equal was Hadrian of the Black. He was the only entity that could fill the void in Badger's soul. With the return of Hadrian, Badger could leave a life of sales and return to what he knew best, traversing the cosmos. He knew that if there was a being on this planet, a being on this plane of existence that could challenge him at any moment, he could feel alive once more. Badger dusted off the Book of the Dead. He had only done necromancy one time in his life as a party trick in the BC era, but his buddy disappeared and was never seen again. Badger had all the necessary items the ritual called for. Candles, allspice, the orb of Anubis, a virgin sacrifice, and the blood of the chosen one. He cleared his living room and prepared for the ritual. Towers was zipping through traffic like a bat out of hell. The case had been weighing on him for so long. He knew if he could talk to Stevens about it, things would open up. Stevens had helped Towers in the past. They worked well together. Stevens had gifted him the identity of the terrible Try, helped solve the disappearance of Jean Bonnet, the little pageant girl, and even hunted down the Zodiac. Stevens was an unspoken secret in the police force, but the one nut he could never crack was the Ripper. Towers wanted this case solved by himself, but now needed help from a friend. Towers pulled into the compound and walked into the front door. He knocked 3 times. Tap, tap, tap. Stevens, open up. It's Towers. I need to talk with you. There was silence. Towers placed his head on the door, could make out the faint sound of what appeared to be an orgy. Stevens, that son of a bitch, Towers said. Always doing the fucking without me. I'm coming in, Towers yelled. Badger arranged all the items in proper order on the floor. Although he did this one other time, he was illiterate to the writings of witches. In fact, Badger hated witches. He burned many of them. He found them on par with the homeless and found them insulting. Just the other day, he killed 14 witches at the park just for calling upon the god of TikTok. He skimmed the book rather quickly. Well, here goes nothing, Badger said. Badger grabbed his dagger and thrust it into his chest. Immediately, the erotic sounds of ghosts and heretics emerged from the book. Lightning filled the room and chaotic clouds filled the air. What the fuck? Badger yelled. Is this a party or what? At that very moment, from the depths of the floorboards, the ghost of Hadrian the Black emerged. His unanimated spirit hung, hovering a foot off the floor. Badger rose to his knees and looked the entity in the eyes. The spirit was gutted at the belly, the eyes removed and nose still wrapped around its neck. Just as I left you, you old son of a bitch, Badger shouted. But at that very moment, from the corner of Badger's eye, he saw Towers enter the room, but it was too late. In a split second, the entity slithered away and into the belly of the only mortal being in the room, that of H.S. Towers. The body twisted, bones broke, flesh turned. Badger stood motionless. Finally, the body stopped twitching and rose to its feet. Arr, if it ain't me old cabin boy, Badger Stevens, the entity said. God damn it, replied Badger. Is this going to be a thing now? Ye thought you could slay Hadrian of... Wait, is this guy fucking Indian? Yes, you dick. He's an Indian officer from Oklahoma, and you must die, Badger said. Pete Sr. inherited the thirsty owl from his father. It had been passed down from generation to generation. Back in the olden days, the owl was used as a whorehouse where politicians would come to sire illegitimate children. Pete Sr.'s great-great-great-great-grandpappy, also named Pete, was the proprietor of the pub and used it as a base of operations to start the revolution. Some say the Thirsty Owl was the oldest bar in the world. Impossible to prove, but every generation of Petes tried to make it a functioning bar. Sir Reginald Pete, at one point in the building's long history, used the Thirsty Owl to harbor criminals. Many a villain passed through the sacred doors of the owl. Many men died so that others shall live. But the Sacred Order of Petes vowed to never let the owl fall victim to politics. It was their duty to make sure it remained neutral to the workings of the world. Some even say, buried under the establishment, located in the very depths of the earth, is a portal to the underworld, a gateway to the beyond. It was said the Sacred Order of Petes knew this, which is why a bar was the perfect disguise. The Petes did everything in their power to keep the location a family secret. They knew the minute it switched hands, the owl's secrets would be uncovered and the universe would be destroyed. Pete Jr., Little Pete, always started his day the same way. He would rise from his twin bed, maidenless, thank the sun for shining through the windows, brush his teeth, comb his hair, zip up his skin suit, and hustle downstairs to open the doors to the owl. On this morning, he ran down to find an eviction notice pinned to the door. Oh no, Little Pete said. I suppose that's it. The government is finally coming a-calling for this old beauty. I suppose I can pick up a true trade now, Pete said. His spirits were high. Finally, he would be free from the owl's clutches. You see, Little Pete never wanted to be the proprietor of a pub. He had dreams. He wanted to be a ventriloquist. He wanted to stage shows for children and put on puppet shows, but he was never given the chance. Instead, his father tasks him with running the owl. Luckily for Pete, the day his father passed along the secrets of the owl, Little Pete was busy working on his hand puppets. But nonetheless, Pete was good at serving drinks. He had a knack for anticipating people's needs. He could also throw his voice, so although it appeared like Pete was standing saying nothing, an entire conversation could be had. Little Pete began the day by sweeping up the floor. He washed all the glasses, he arranged all the bottles, he stocked all the coolers with fresh beer. He laid out all the napkins and sliced up all the garnishes. He hopped off the bar stool, ran to switch the sign from closed to open. He went back behind the bar. He served a few people throughout the day. He talked, he smiled, asked questions. He was the kind of bartender that could keep secrets. He was Little Pete. Around 1:30 a.m., right before Pete was calling it a night, the front door blasted open. Pete almost shit himself. The shape lingered in the doorway. Pete wasn't able to make out who it was. "Hi there, chap. Almost closing time, but I can serve you a final cold one if you'd like," Pete said. The shape remained silent. "Well, are you coming in or not?" Pete said. "Everyone's welcome at the Thirsty Owl." The shape took a step forward, its white grin appearing to cut through the darkness. It walked in, was bloody soaked, badly beaten, death looking. It was none other than Officer H.S. Towers. Towers was dragging a long trash bag behind him. He took a seat at the bar and smiled. "Well, hello, Peter. We meet again," Towers said. Little Pete had this strange look on his face. Not once in his life had he ever been called Peter. In fact, the only member of his family to have ever carried the Peter name was his great-great-great-great-great grandfather back in the early 1700s. "Sorry, sir, you seem to be mistaken," Pete said. "Don't think you can fool me, Peter. You still look like the same lump of flesh. I never forget a face," Towers said. "Towers," Pete said. "It's me, Little Pete." "Enough of this back and forth," Towers screams. "Fetch me a bushel of ale." Pete was entirely confused. Towers didn't drink. And what the fuck was a bushel of ale? Pete walked away and returned with a pint of beer. "So what's in the bloody soaked bag, Towers?" Pete said. "None of your goddamn business, boy," Towers yelled. "And who is this Towers you speak of?" Towers replied. "Are you kidding me? You're Towers. H.S. Towers, to be exact," Pete said. Towers stroked his chin. The life in his eyes appeared to be fading. "This puppet must have had a name," Towers whispered. "Boy, how well did you know this Towers?" he said. "Pretty well. You come in here all the time," said Pete. "Do you fornicate with this man?" "What?" Pete squealed. "I would never." "But there was that Christmas party." "Never mind," he said. "Why are you asking all these questions?" Pete said. "When the time is right, you shall know," Towers said. "Boy, canst thou do me a favor, this Towers?" "Sure, I suppose." Towers looked down at the bloody bag. "Dispose of this bag, but do not look at the contents of the satchel." Pete looked over the bar and down at the bag. "It looks awfully heavy," he said. "But sure, Mr. Towers, I can dump it for you." "Very well, boy. I shall return when the business is done. And remember, do not look in the bag." Towers downed his pint of ale and walked off into the storm. Little Pete looked over the bar and down at the bloody bag. "That looks like one heavy fucking bag," he said. Pete walked around and started dragging the bag with all his might. He moved it a few feet before he had to rest. There was no way he could muster enough strength to make it outside. But then he thought of an idea. What if he dumped it in the bar cellar? There was a chute with a deep hole next to the kegs. He could dump the bag there. Pete pulled the bag to the stairs, then with one big push shoved it down the dark cellar. The bag landed with a giant thud. Pete scurried down and ran into the corner and lifted the hatch. On the hatch was an old rusted plate that read, "Entrance to the Nether Realm." Pete thought. Wonder what that means. Oh well. He whipped open the hatch, heard the biggest death-curdling scream. "Yikes," Pete said. "Better hurry." Pete used the last of his strength to heave the bag into the hole and slam the hatch shut. He dusted off his hands and went about the rest of his day. When Badger Stevens' eyes opened, all he saw was darkness. It took him a minute to rein in his focus. When he did, he saw nothing but darkness. Badger rose to his feet. He extended his hands forward to see if he could get a better idea of his surroundings. He felt nothing. He could see nothing. All his eyes and senses were void. Badger took a deep breath and started walking in the darkness. What could this place be? The last thing he remembered was looking into the eyes of Hadrian of the Black. Then all went dark. Badger walked for what felt like hours. Finally, off in the distance, he noticed a soft glow, the light at the end of the void. Walking up to the light, he noticed it was coming from behind a door. Badger turned the knob and walked into the hustle of a familiar place. He stepped into the Cosmic Diner. He noticed he was completely naked. Everyone in the establishment was naked. His body was purely void of all scars like the day he was born. "Order up," a voice said from behind the counter. "Table for one," the lady said. She eyed Badger from head to toe. "I suppose," he said. She led Badger down the aisle, passing greats like Alexander and his old friends like Bourdain, Thompson, Taylor Hawkins, and even President JFK. "Is that what I think it is?" Badger said. "It's just a diner, honey," the lady replied. "What do you want? Can I see a menu?" "Are you shitting me? You're naked in a fucking diner. What do you think we serve here?" "Fine. 2 eggs, order of hash, coffee black, and a waffle," Badger said. The lady scribbled down a few notes in her pad and walked away. Badger looked around at all the other entities in the diner. Some faces he knew, others he didn't. In the far back corner sat 3 men Badger met while on crusade with the Spanish. They hired him to deliver gifts to a hidden race of people. Instead, Badger stole the money, hung the trio, and slaughtered the race of Aboriginals. At another table sat some of Badger's favorite authors. They appeared to be discussing something important. Another bunch were old scientists of old. All around him were either people he came across in life or those that died by his hand. "Here's your food, hun." "How much?" Badger said. "You don't even have pockets." "Just being polite," he said. The lady gave him a smirk and walked off. "Wait, this isn't what I ordered," Badger yelled as the lady walked off. She brought him a small bowl of quail eggs, dry toast, and 3 glasses of water. "That's actually what I ordered," a voice from behind the bar said. Badger turned around and came face to face with a man that looked exactly like himself. "Badger Stevens, pleasure to meet you," the man said. He extended his hand. "What the fuck?" Badger replied. The copy walked around and sat across from Badger and began gobbling all the food. "Can't let it go to waste," he said. "You know, I thought you would be taller and have a bigger peen," the copy said. Badger remained speechless. "Who are you?" "I'm you." "Well, I will be you in a couple of centuries." "What do you mean, will be?" Badger said. "It's complicated, but regardless, I am you and you are me, and right now we are fucked." Badger Stevens remained motionless for a moment. All the copy did was consume massive quantities of quail eggs. For some odd reason, Badger could never wrap his head around this moment. "Hey, buddy, snap out of it," his copy said. "I think I need a drink. Now we're talking." The copy signaled to the waitress for a round of drinks. She arrived at the table with 6 beers, 2 margaritas, a bag of hash, 8 shots of whiskey, 6 bumps of white Charlie, a single grapefruit, and 2 double Godfathers. "That should tide us over for an hour or so," the copy said. "Drink up." "I don't follow." "I don't know if I should," Badgers replied. "You're going to need it if you plan on learning the call of the owl and getting us the fuck out of here." "The call of the owl?" Badgers replied. "Yes, pay attention and drink up." "I still don't understand where here is." "You are at the apex of the universe, my friend, the place between here and there." the first and last stop on your way to eternal damnation or eternal salvation. It's a waypoint where the metaphysical meets the subconscious buried in that thick fucking skull of yours. Badger grabbed a beer and chased it with a shot of whiskey and a bump of coke. Jesus Christ, I don't remember us being such a piece of shit, the copy said. The two Stevens remained quiet for a bit and consumed drink after drink. Finally, Badger spoke. What's your point in all this? Badger said. The copy downed another beer and took a puff of a joint. Well, to be honest, my job is to kill you and take your place back in reality. Badger thought. That sounds like something I would do. Yeah, the copy said. We do shit like that. Why do you need to take my place? Are you saying I'm dead? Are you kidding me? You're eating and drinking in a diner where everyone's naked. You're talking to a better, well-hung version of yourself while Hunter Thompson sits 50 feet away. Of course you're fucking dead. Hadrian of the Black did you in. It was a real stupid idea trying to revive that piece of shit. Do you remember how hard it was to kill him once? And you fucking wanted to do it a second time? Jesus. Badger thought for a moment and then downed another drink. He was foolish to think he could outsmart Hadrian a second time. I needed an arch enemy. I needed that hunger. Arch enemy? You're like 500 years old. Isn't one enough? I'm going to take your body and use my skills to open an Italian pizza deli. What? A pizza deli? Badger said. Is it pizza or is it a sandwich? It's both. Trust me, one day you'll understand, the copy said. What happens to me if you go and I stay? Badger said. You become the faceless void. The what? At that moment, the copy ripped off his face and revealed a million tiny faces screaming in agony, all clumped together like a disease. The copy then reattached his face, and all went black for Badger Stevens. Badger Stevens eyed the copy up and down once more. The faceless void continued to shove the eggs in his mouth, followed by jugs and jugs of water. So let me get this straight. You kill me and take my place in reality. In exchange, I become you? Correct, the copy said. And what's to stop me from just outright killing you, Badger said. Because you need me to teach you the call of the owl. It's the only way to return back to the plane of existence. So if you already know it, why don't you go back? That's the trick. Now that I'm the faceless void, it would be like shuttling 4,000 souls in one person car. It just doesn't compute. Badger stood silent for a moment. He grabbed his frosty margarita and took a sip. He placed the glass back down on the table and crossed his arms. You need a body to escape this place, but you first need to teach me, what is it called? The call of the owl, the void replied. And what if I refuse to learn it? What if we stay here for all eternity? Then you eventually succumb to madness. I wait for another version of you to walk through the door and I kill him instead. See, I don't think that's how it works, Badger said. Go on. If I'm you and I know myself as best as you do, we wait for nothing. We are bloodthirsty harbingers of death. We seek out the weak and take from them anything we desire. Plus, there's no way in hell we are letting Hadrian get away with what he did to us. Badger Stevens was right. He was a creature of nothing, an entity so evil it could not be contained. It only made sense that he would become a ferryman of the souls of this world. He had ended the lives of so many and would end the lives of so many more. That was his purpose, not selling insurance. However, he did pretty good at that. What if we went back together? Impossible, the void said. Others have tried and all have failed. Even badgers with bigger peckers than yours have tried. The void must always be on this side of the plane of existence. Where's the bathroom? Badger said. Past the door where you came in, the void replied. Badger stood up from the booth and walked past the door. Where? To the right, the void yelled. This way? No, your other right. For God's sake, are you really this idiotic? The void stood up and walked to Badger to guide him to the bathroom. Right before he passed the entrance to the Cosmic Diner, Badger tackled him through the door. "You fool!" the Void yelled. "What have you done?" "I'm saving our ass," Badger yelled back. In an instant, everything inside the diner began to be sucked into the blackness. All the naked beings, the food, the booths, the booze, everything was collapsing in on itself. Badger and the Void began to mingle into one being in agonizing pain. The faceless Void ripped off its flesh, and the blood-curdling screams pierced Badger's ears. Then everything stopped, and he was back in the blacklist, alone. Everything was quiet. Little Pete was going about his daily routine when suddenly the ground beneath him began to shake. It was small at first, then the moment began to shake the table, then the glasses started to fall off, then the entire roof was ripped off the Thirsty Owl. Pete was shocked. Up above, through the clouds, was lightning and what appeared to be a ghost ripping through the skies. The clouds were a grayish purple, and a giant face could be seen ripping itself apart over and over again. Bodies began to be sucked up into the sky. People were being fused together, screaming in pain, then ripped apart instantly. Pete ran out the front door to see the chase unfold, but he stepped only a few feet from the door. The Thirsty Owl was suspended at least 50 feet from the ground, having been blown up into the sky. Little Pete ran back inside in a panic. What could he do? What could anyone do? The very fabric of reality was being shattered at this very moment. Souls were fusing with the living were being ripped through space and time. On the corner, a man was aging backwards into dust, then being reshaped over and over again. Animals were evolving and devolving at will, running through the streets in a mad craze. Pete ran behind the bar and grabbed a drink and tossed it back. Then he sat motionless, covering his ears, hoping to block out the sounds from below. Suddenly, lightning began striking inside the bar, blast after blast. Souls and ghosts alike were swooping down and hovering through the walls of the bar. Pete shut his eyes. Maybe this was all in his dreams. Then everything stopped. Pete opened his eyes and everything was as it was. The roof was back on. The sounds of madness had stopped. He opened the door to the bar and looked out into a quiet, empty street. Was Pete hitting the bottle too hard? Perhaps all those long nights with Badger and Towers were finally catching up with him. He slapped himself in the face to make sure he wasn't dreaming. Pete walked back into the bar and poured himself a shot of whiskey and tossed it back. That had to have been a nightmare, he thought. There was no way that was real. The visions, the screams, all of it had to be made up. The day went on. The bar was filled with customers, and Pete asked people if they had seen the horrors he did. None of them did. They thought Pete was a crazy son of a bitch. "Is the Molly too strong for you, Pete?" one person said. "Maybe take the drugs after you eat breakfast, Pete," said another man. "Maybe you're right. Maybe it was all in my melon." But Pete knew what he had seen. He heard the screams. He saw the face in the sky. Perhaps someone, anyone, had seen it. Maybe Badger did. He hadn't heard from him in some time. He grabbed the landline and gave him a call. Nothing. The line just rang and rang. He hung up the phone and picked it up again. This time he tried Towers. Maybe he saw something. Again, no answer. Suddenly the door to the Thirsty Owls kicked open, the door almost breaking off its hinges. A shriveled up human walked through the door. He had a black cloak and hood. His cane looked to have been made from the bones of something not of this world. One would say he looked like a tiny wizard, but that would be an insult. The stranger walked up to the bar and demanded to speak with the Lord of the Owl. "Where is this Pete in charge?" the little human said. Pete raised his hand. "That be me, sir. Little Pete. Welcome to the Thirsty Owl." "Who might you be?" "I am Knox Paddington," the man said, "and you, sir, are in deep shit." Badger Stevens was back in the darkness. He moved his hand forward a bit and felt fabric. He could barely move around. His feet appeared to be bound. His head was in such pain. He felt the fabric again and started to push and claw till finally he broke through. Eventually, a hole was punctured and he stuck his finger through it. He felt rock and stone. He began ripping the fabric until he made a hole big enough for his head to poke through. The air was salty and moist. He was in a cellar. He ripped the bag open and undid his bindings and began looking around. His head was still in pain. The last thing he remembered was tackling the void through the doorway. But now he was in some pit. Badger rose to his feet and began trying to find a way out. At the end of the enclosure, he noticed a wooden ladder. He looked up at the hole and he could hear the faint sounds of laughter. Perhaps it was even screaming. At this point, he couldn't tell and really didn't give a shit. He started to climb. Eventually, he came to the top of the hole and pushed open the hatch. He was in a beer cellar. Badger looked around and kicked in one of the kegs and started sucking at the booze like a wild animal. After he was done, he wiped his mouth and started looking for a way out. At the other side of the room were the stairs leading up to somewhere. As Badger climbed, he could hear the voice of Little Pete and realized he was in the cellar of the Thirsty Owl. Before he pushed open the door, he hesitated. Where had the faceless void gone? What happened to the diner? Was everything a dream? It couldn't have been. Suddenly, Badger's arms began to twitch. It began to bend and turn on itself. He had no control over it. The ghost arm began ripping through his skin. Badger had never been in so much pain. He tumbled back down the stairs, landing on his back. "You idiot," a voice said inside Badger's head. "Do you know what you have done?" Every time the void spoke, it felt like 1,000 needles were being pressed against his brain. "Stop speaking," Badger screamed. "This is your fault," the voice replied. "Because of your selfishness, you are now harboring all of reality inside that tiny little skull of yours. Every soul known to have ever existed is floating around in your head like ants in a jar." "The pain," Badger screamed. Badger tried to rise to his feet once more, but another ghost leg appeared to rip through his flesh, making him fall once more. He screamed in pain and fell back again. "Make it stop," Badger yelled. "It's impossible. You are now the faceless void, except you're on the wrong side of the tracks." "How do we get back?" Badger said. "That's no easy task unless you can find a Lord of the Owl and learn the call of the owl. If you can't, you're stuck this way." "Who is speaking?" Badger said. "It's me, well, the guy that will eventually be you. It's me, Badger Stevens." The pain continued to have Badger pinned to the floor. The last thing he remembered, the voice saying, was Lord of the Owl and learning the call of the owl. What could all that gibberish possibly mean? Elsewhere, Little Pete had trouble of his own. This new guest, Knox Paddington, was getting the whole bar riled up. He was standing on a table, waving his cane in the air, shouting looniness. "The end is near," Paddington shouted. "Everyone here shall become a face in the body of evil. Drink up, you fools. The end is coming, unless I, Knox Paddington, stop it." The old man continued to yell his threatening call while Little Pete paced back and forth. What would Badger do, he thought. He would probably slit this old man's throat, but Little Pete wouldn't hurt a fly. Maybe he could call Detective Powers. The man was a cop, after all. He could arrest this bastard and take him away. But he's an old man, Pete thought. This guy wouldn't survive a night in the joint. The decision was giving Pete anxiety. "You there, the one they call Pete, the false prophet." "Me?" Pete said. "No, the man with crippling anxiety behind you," Paddington said. "Yes, you buffoon. Give all these men free ale. The world is coming to an end. Unless I, Knox Paddington, speak with the Lord to help banish the evil." Pete was running out of time. The customers were starting to demand free booze, and things were starting to look dark for Little Pete. "I am the Lord," Pete shouted at the top of his lungs. "I am Little Pete." The bar went silent. Pete had never once raised his voice. Paddington squinted and hopped off the table. You dare you call yourself a Pete? I am Pete. See, look here. Behind the bar, above the glass, that's my family tree. Paddington pulled out his glasses to get a better look. By God, Paddington said, you are a Pete. The family tree was massive. It stretched the length of the wall. Each Pete was more handsome and more muscular than the last. That was until you reached Little Pete's photo. You are a Pete, Paddington said, a rather foolish one, but nonetheless you are from the royal bloodline. You are a protector of the gate, and the one that can help I, Knox Paddington, prevent the evil of all things. Quick, boy, show me the gate. I don't know what you're talking about, Pete said. I am a humble bartender. Fool, the gate. I must find the entrance at once. Every Pete since the beginning of time knows where the entrance is. It's their duty. But I have no clue. Paddington leaped in the air and attached himself to Pete's head. Coward! Paddington screamed. You must know the way. If not, the earth, the plane of existence, will collapse in on itself. Pete wiped the little wizard off his face. His panic was racing. His mind was breaking. All of a sudden, the cellar door was kicked open, and emerging from the depths of the Thirsty Owl was a very frail and sickly-looking Badger Stevens. When Towers left Thirsty Owl, something felt different. The strings of war were no longer bound by him. After finally defeating Badger Stevens, Towers was free. But what is a man that only knows war supposed to do? He stood outside the owl for a moment, breathing in the fresh air. He looked down at his bloody hands and wiped his clothes. His boots were stained and his face was heavily scarred. The epic battle with Badger had taken a toll on him. It had taken a heavy toll on Hadrian of the Black. He walked down the street. He was hungry. This body needs subsistence, Hadrian said. He continued walking a little further down the road until he arrived at a sandwich shop. He entered the establishment and walked up to the counter. Food, now, he said. The cashier was playing on her phone, punched in some numbers, and handed him a ticket. Next, she said. Hadrian was ushered aside and found himself sitting at a table. All of this was new to the Lord of Chaos. Never before had he needed to wait for a meal. He looked around and noticed people taking trays of food from another counter. He walked up and once again demanded a meal. The young teen looked uninterested in him and simply handed him a tray of slop. Hadrian returned to the table and started consuming the mystery meal. Never have I tasted such riches, he yelled. Hadrian continued to inhale the food at a rapid speed. When he was finished, he returned to the counter and grabbed himself another tray of slop. After 5 trays of food, he licked the grease from his fingers and walked out of the restaurant. What other luxuries and treasures does this foreign land hold, he said. That day, Hadrian dined on some of the finest meals known to man: ice cream, soda, deviled eggs, smoothies, hot dogs, candy corn, beets, French fries, which he did not enjoy. He sipped coffee and goat's milk. He ate peanuts and shrimp and fish and blue crabs. He walked into a modern-day whorehouse and a Best Buy and saw things on screens. He rode a scooter and hailed an Uber and ran with dogs in the park. Hadrian was free to do anything he wanted. No longer did he crave battle. No longer did he desire to pillage and rape and take what was his. As the day ended, he found himself walking in a strip mall. How could such a marvelous day come to an end, he said. Long have I fought to achieve such a moment in life. Serenity and peace. But Hadrian's peace would never extend beyond that day. At that very moment, the skies began to darken and the elements began to rumble through the ground. Off in the distance, he saw lightning falling from the sky. He saw the face emerge from the darkness and the souls break the plane of existence. Deep in his soul, he knew what was happening. He had seen it once before, almost a millennia ago. He knew Badger had found a way back to the world, and he knew the shepherd of the owl was on his way to help him. That son of a bitch is coming to seek revenge. The shepherd must not find him. I have become accustomed to this life, he said. Hadrian of the Black knew what he needed to accomplish. He needed to find the shepherd and kill him. He needed to hunt down and put an end to Knox Paddington once and for all. The earth and gods and time were not kind to men like Knox Paddington. In his youth, Paddington was a fierce warrior. Unlike Badger Stevens, Hadrian of the Black, and their crew, Paddington took up the sword for a different reason. He took up the sword to get chicks. While warriors like Badger were out slaying demons and spirits, dragons, pirates, goblins, the wicked spirits of men, Knox was busy slaying tail. But the thing about Knox was no matter how much puss he had, the hole in his heart could never be filled. His heart was stuck on another. He had a forbidden love, something that would never be accepted. You see, one night during a fierce raid in which he was almost slain, a brave warrior rescued him. That warrior was none other than Hadrian of the Black. But while Hadrian was able to defeat the clutches of time, Knox was not. He grew sour. He grew bitter. He devoted his mind to defeating the mechanics of time and protecting the Owl Lords. They blessed him with time, but at the cost of his youth. Now a wise and bitter old man, Knox could no longer slay as he once did. He would eventually quit the game all at once, cold turkey, like an addict, quitting heroin. He only saw Hadrian of the Black one other time, following their first encounter. He still loved him, but Hadrian knew nothing could come from their forbidden tryst. The one night they shared was up in the mountains, herding sheep. They camped by the fire and spoke of a life neither of them could ever see. Eventually, Knox grew to spite Hadrian, and Hadrian grew to spite him. Their one and only night together ended like a 30-beer, 6 Godfather night usually does, in shambles. Knox Paddington went on to lead the shepherd and become protector of the Lord of Owls. He would spend his life watching over the peats and the gates and after. Hadrian would go on to pirate his ship the Black and find a lonely boy he called Badger. But now it seemed like fate had other plans for the two immortal beings. Hadrian knew of Paddington's vow to protect the gate at all cost, but he also knew, should Badger return, his life would be finished. If he could stop Knox Paddington from returning Badger Stevens to the beyond and slay him in his current force, he could continue his new life of peace and ice cream. Badger Stevens was in rough shape. As the voices talked, his body would fold in on itself. He lay moaning in pain on the floor of the Thirsty Owl. Around him stood Little Pete and Paddington. Badger Stevens is the fool who crossed over from the after, Paddington said. I guess so, said Pete. What exactly is the after, and what is wrong with Badger? Boy, you know nothing. Badger is suffering from psychosis, from harboring all the souls in the after. They shouldn't be on this plane, and thus must be returned to their proper resting place. But where the hell is that? Pete yelled. Quick, boy, take me to the hatch. Take me to the location of the entrance to the beyond. I have no idea what you're talking about, Pete said. I run a failing bar. I'm 22 years old. I'm just Little Pete. Knox whipped his cane around and struck Pete in the gut. You foolish boy. The fate of the universe rests in your hands. If we don't get Badger back to the beyond, life as we know it will cease to exist. Knox knew that Badger needed to return the souls to the beyond, but the only way was to teach him the call of the owl and then thrust him inside the gates at the exact same time. Little did he know that evil was making its way to the Thirsty Owl at that very moment. Badger Stevens lay on the floor looking like a shriveled old man. The souls he was harboring within were literally draining his life force. The great Badger Stevens, immortal warrior, killer of the homeless, devourer of worlds, would soon be reduced to dust. Knox and Little Pete looked motionless, not knowing which was up and which way was down. Oh, no, 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 screamed Pete. Focus, you fool. We must find a way to the gate. It has to be here. Who led Badger to the gate in the first place? Paddington said. What are you talking about? I didn't even know he was here. How could you not know the great Badger Stevens was not amongst your establishment? Pete was lost. The only thing that was happening was I threw the bag in the hole like I was told, and then that fucking face appeared in the sky, and now you, the fucking wizard, is here, in a bar. What do you mean threw the bag in the hole? What bag? And from where? The bag, the bloody bag that Detective Towers gave me. He said, throw it out back, but it was super heavy, and shit, you know what? I think Badger was in the bag, Pete said. That makes a lot of sense now. But why would Towers kill Badger? Pete asked. I shall look into his mind and discover the origins of this tale, Paddington said. Paddington leaped on the table and flung open his cloak. He began waving his serpent staff around until a cloud of gray smoke began to hover around Badger. Badger's body began to lift off the floor. His clothes were ripped off in an instant, and the soul of Knox Paddington was sucked into his immortal body and transported into Badger like some sort of fusion. As Badger floated motionless and the physical body of Knox fell to the table, all Pete could do was wait. Suddenly, in a flash of lightning, the body of Badger was thrust against the wall and Knox returned to life. By God, this man attempted to use the book of necromancy to raise the dead, Knox said. This is worse than I thought. A great evil is headed this way. What evil? Said Pete. What the fuck are you talking about? What flesh prison you interacted with was not this Detective Towers you speak of. It's none other than Hadrian of the Black. Pete looked confused for a moment. What the fuck is that? Jesus Christ, boy, do you know nothing? What can you do but stand there and waste air? Pete zipped away and returned in an instant with a perfectly made martini. Try this, he said. Knox took a sip. By God, if that is not the best damn martini I ever had. And I drank a teeny with the blood of 200 virgins. What else can you do? You can lead me to the gate of the after? No, Pete said. I can't do that, but there is this hole in the basement I can show you. You are useless, boy, but show me this building's deep hole. Knox and Little Pete dragged the body of Badger Stevens once again down the stairs and towards the back of the cellar to where the hatch and the gate were. But at that very instant, they heard a violent shout from upstairs. The door had been kicked in with a loud thump. Knox Paddington, I know you're here, Towers shouted. Show yourself, little man. The trio could hear the stomping of Towers on the floor above. Panic was setting in. Little Pete looked at Knox Paddington, who then looked at a comatose Badger Stevens. What do we do? Said Pete. You have to teach him the call of the owl, then get him in the gate. I will stall Hadrian for as long as I can. But in this frail state, I shall not be able to overcome him for long. What is the call of the owl? We don't have time, boy. You must teach him or we are all doomed. Knox whipped his cloak off and scurried up the stairs, bolting through the door. As the door closed, Knox slowly turned to face the tormented body of Detective H.S. Towers. At first, his heart was full. He still cared for Hadrian. He had his muscular looks, his impeccable physique, his voice like the sound of a demon's whisper. But once he laid eyes on him, all that went away. Holy fuck, Knox said, surprisingly. You look terrible. Facing Knox was the tormented body of Towers. It appeared like his body was projecting the spirit of Hadrian and trying to claw its way from the bone. The face was all twisted, the eyes as black as night, Towers as pearly white, turban now covered in spots of blood. Hadrian was breathing like a mad dog, his shoulders hunched over like a killer werewolf. Knox Paddington, surprised to see me, Towers growled. Not in the slightest. You have really done a number on this poor man's body, he said. Perhaps I'm in need of a new vessel to complete my quest. Now, let's talk about this. Here, pull up a chair, Knox said. Knox scurried over to an empty table and sat down, grabbed himself a cold pint of beer along the way. At first, Towers appeared confused. Well, I am thirsty. It was a pretty long bike ride back to this place, Towers said. It was like 15 miles at least. Here, have a cold one. On the house. What the hell? What's one cold beer going to do before I inhabit your body for the rest of eternity? Towers pulled up a chair and began chugging his beverage. Slow it down, Knox said. We haven't seen each other in centuries. How you been? How have I been? Said Towers. Look at me. This meat puppet suit is falling apart. My only son is trying to kill me again. 2 times. I've been dead for over a half century, haven't been laid in longer, and I just experienced this thing called quesadillas. All good things, Knox replied. Well, you see, buddy, we kind of got to get Badger back to the after, or else the entire universe will implode. So be it. If I am to suffer at the hands of that monster, all will be lost. I was afraid you'd say that. In an instant, Knox Paddington flung his cloak aside and uttered magical gibberish. Lightning struck down from above and struck Towers in the face, melting off part of his skin, exposing the bone. Another spell cast and violent winds ripped through the thirsty owl, tossing Towers every which way. Landing off in the corner, Towers stood with Badger's daggers in full display. So you want to do it the hard way, Towers said. Pete paced back and forth frantically. He could hear the commotion upstairs and was turning bleak. Pete had zero experience in the supernatural or hand-to-hand combat. He was and always had been a bartender, but now he was thrust into the world of chaos and dark magic. The last thing the Knox said was teach him the call of the owl and send him back to the after. What the hell did that even mean, Pete thought. He knew that frail old geezer could not stand up to Towers. Towers would turn him into a PB&J sandwich. Think, Pete said. Okay, call of the owl. What the fuck does that even mean? Owls don't make a sound. All they do is hoo. In that very instant, a blue glow hovered around Pete. He rose off the ground, and plates of armor appeared out of thin air. They began attaching themselves to Pete like a robot ninja warrior. First the feet, chest, arms, gauntlets, and finally the hood of the owl. Holy shit, yelled Pete. Pete had transformed into the guardian owl, part of the sacred lineage, the royal bloodline of Pete's. In this new form, Pete had the strength of a garbage truck and speed of a velociraptor. His vision was as sharp as an owl, and his blade, the mighty owl katana, could cut through butter in one fell swoop. Okay, that was the call of owl, I assume. What's next? Pete thought. Right, send him back to the after. Pete lifted up the hatch and kicked Badger Stevens into the hole once more. As he fell, he yelled out, "All you need to do is who." In that moment, the armor evaporated from Pete, and he was left back to his original form. Badger Stevens fell with a thud back on the diner table. At first, he tried to open his eyes. They were heavy. His brains were scrambled eggs, his body hurt, and his wounds had yet to heal. "You're back," the diner woman said. "Can I get you anything, hun?" At first, Badger had trouble getting to his feet. He rolled off the table and fell on the booth. "Where is everyone?" Badger said. "Look in the mirror, hun." "What? The mirror over there. Look at it." Badger stumbled over the mirror and looked at it. His body was a grotesque form that looked like it had been tattooed all over, except all the ink was in the shape of hands and faces that looked like they were trying to claw their way out of his body. "What the fuck is this?" he said. "You are the new faceless void," the employee said, "the harbinger of death." Before, when they spoke, I could hear them. Why can't I hear them anymore? Things work differently here in the after. I need to get back to reality. There is a man I need to kill and people I need to save. All you have to do is walk through the door and use the call of the owl, she said. But if you do, nothing will ever be the same. You will bring chaos to the world, and nothing but death will follow. Badgers began walking to the door. Before he walked through, he turned and looked at the lady one final time. "I'm counting on it," he said with a smile. "Whoo!" Badger Stevens made the call of the owl as he leaped gracefully into the void. He tumbled for what felt like ages, but he felt at peace. The vengeful spirit had vanished from the chaotic warrior. He felt calm. He felt at one with space-time reality, as all beings should be in the after. Badger could feel all the souls coursing through his body. He felt them speak, talk, discuss the possibilities of life and death. He heard their circles of justice and even felt their tears. His eyes grew heavy with madness and he fell. But then, with another thud, he came crashing into the thirsty owl. He blasted through the roof and landed face down on a broken table in a pool of warm blood. That hurt, he said. Really, though. Really thought I would have stuck the landing. Badger slowly rose to his feet. His strength had returned. He was dressed in a sleek silk robe with a red belt. He had gauntlets of black dragon scale and boots to match. His hood was a crimson red, and his waistband had his trusty silver flask. He stood clueless for a moment. This was the owl, but it seemed different. There was an eerie gray mist floating around. Everything was aged and destroyed like time had run its course. Things were quiet. Then he heard the snapping of bones and crunching of flesh. Over in the corner, there appeared to be a monstrous hand chewing on something. The creature stood and slowly turned to face Badger. It was the decomposing corpse of H.S. Towers, but due to the longevity of Hadrian's spirit, it had reverted to a beast-like form. In his hands were Badger's trusty daggers. The creature was using them as claws to tear and rip at the flesh of a body on the floor. Badger squinted a bit to see the twitching remains of Knox Paddington. This guy wanted to fuck me, so I killed him, Towers said. I can see that, Badger said. I believe you have something of mine. Those daggers do not belong to you. They were given to you by me. Give them back. I won't ask again, Badger said. I defeated you, Badger Stevens. I shall do it again. But now I have the spirit of Knox Paddington, and with that, his cosmic powers. What exactly are his powers? I don't really know yet. I see. They sound pretty lame if you ask me. Silence. Look around. You've been gone too long. This world is already doomed. There is no way you can save them. None of them. Who said anything about saving them? I'm just here to kill you again, Hadrian. In a swift strike, like a fly's essence, Badger punched Towers to the ground. He grabbed his trusted daggers and secured them in his waistband. You won't win, Towers said. You are who you are because of me. He was right, Badger thought. He was the greatest warrior in existence because he was trained and defeated by the greatest warrior in existence. Badger spat in the face of Towers. Fuck off, he said. Badger stomped the exposed skull of Towers and watched it break underneath his boot. An explosion of light burst from the ground, and the spirit of Hadrian of the Black creeped up from the corpse like a genie exiting a bottle. But before it could speak, Badger inhaled it in one quick breath, stealing the soul of Hadrian inside him as it became a part of the faceless void. One down, one to go, Badger said. A hand touched his boot, and he looked over to see the animated corpse of Knox Paddington crawling towards him. Kill me, it said. Please kill me, it begged. Yikes, that's terrible, Badger said. The evil had been slayed. Finally, after all the chaos, Badger Stevens eliminated his archenemy Hadrian of the Black for a second time. After wiping the blood of Knox Paddington off his daggers and surveying the owl, something came over him. There was a madness brewing within. He felt the rage of 10,000 machines, but these feelings were unlike any other Badger had felt before. The world was still crumbling around him, and down in the cellar, little Pete stood motionless, waiting for something to exit the hatch. He heard the commotion upstairs and wondered if he should try and help Knox. Pete gave the call of the owl, summoning armor, and slowly made his way up to the stairs. Pete had never done battle before. Now that he thought about it, he had never even been in a fight before. There was a little dispute he had with a customer about the proper way to make a martini, gin or vodka, but that just ended after they took the man out back and knocked some sense into him. But that guy was never seen around the Thirsty Owl ever again. But this time was different. He remembered Knox's words. Hadrian was coming to stop him from saving the galaxy. As Pete opened the cellar door, it wasn't Hadrian or Knox that he found. Rather, it was a hellish-looking Badger Stevens that appeared to be suffering from some type of madness. His eyes were leaking tears of fire, his mouth was drooling blood, and his hands were covered in a dark liquid. His laugh was like nothing Pete had ever heard, and to be honest, it scared the shit out of him. Jesus, Badger, is that you? Badger is no more, you meatbag. We are only the faceless void. The what? The faceless void, the bringer of chaos, the ruler of the after and before and the always. Pete froze in his tracks. He didn't know what to do, nor what to say. He was going to fight Badger. Would he be able to defeat his friend? I call on the power of the thirsty owl and all the owls before me, Pete yelled. Pete began hovering above the ground, sucking the energy from the owl itself. The crazed beast, formerly known as Badger Stevens, looked on. Then it drew forth the daggers of calling. This will not end well for you, boy, the faceless void said. I beg to differ. Pete drew forth a blade of light, a golden sword fit for a god, and charged the faceless void. Moving faster than the speed of light, the void snatched the sword away from Pete and thrust it into the tiny skull that was little Pete. Shirking like a lamb kebab, the body hung there on the blade of light until it slid down, falling to the floor. Eternity appeared to be coming to an end. Outside, the storm grew. Buildings crumbled and lightning was striking. Massive tornadoes began prepping, engulfing everything in their path. The faceless void began to laugh hysterically. It laughed and laughed and laughed until the landline at the Thirsty Owl began to ring. Well, that's just rude, the void said. The void walked over to the phone and picked it up. Hello? Yes, I'm looking for little Pete. This is the insurance company calling about Badger Stevens, a voice said on the other end. For a moment, the entity that was the faceless void was halted in its tracks. Hello? Is anyone there? The voice on the other end of the phone said. I can hear you breathing. Is this little Pete? The void struggled to speak. Dipping into its subconscious where the spirits of Badger Stevens was contained, it accessed its memory and deduced the following. Hadrian of the Black was not this form's true enemy. Although they remained in battle for centuries, their greed and corruption were only fueled by one thing, the entity known as capitalism. Hello, the voice said again. I'm looking for a little Pete. Is this him? At that moment, the void scanned Badger Stevens' memory bank, and in the corner there was the true master. The shape-shifting ghoul known as capitalism pulling the strings at every corner. How could Badger Stevens be so blind? All the war, murder, slaughtering of homeless vagrants was in the name of capitalism. All the pillaging, the treasure hunting, the sex with women could be traced back to some deed capitalism wanted done. The void dropped the phone and stumbled back. Its limbs and body began convulsing. Its head shook frantically until it was foaming at the mouth. It fell down to its knees, and fire began shooting from its eyes, mouth, until 1,000 red, burning souls began shooting out of its body. The void began screaming in pain, its body losing power with every lost soul. The chaos it was destined to inflict was succumbing to a higher power. Back at Badger Stevens' apartment, the Book of the Dead began sucking in the red souls of chaos. One by one, they were absorbed into the pages until the last one entered with a fierce closing of the book. Back at the Thirsty Owl, the lifeless body of Badger Stevens lay motionless. Outside, the world was transformed back to its former state. The violent earthquakes, lightning storms, the blood-curdling screams were all gone. With a quick gasp, the body of Badger Stevens inhaled air and began moving once more. Jesus Christ, Badger said. He struggled to get to his feet. His brain was a pile of mashed potatoes, and he was covered head to toe in blood. Although the faceless void was returned back to the after, Badger Stevens finally knew his purpose. After all these years, he finally understood his one true enemy, capitalism. Badger pushed open the door to the bar and emerged into the sunny street. He looked and felt like he had been on a weeks-long bender. How could he defeat this new enemy? He needed to get home. He needed to regroup, or he thought. Should he take the fight right to the man? It's time to punch in and kick capitalism in the dick, Badger said. He grabbed Tower's bike and began riding towards the insurance company. He didn't have a plan, but he knew this would be the hardest battle he would ever face. All his training led to this. Badger Stevens was coming face to face with a 5-day work week. Not many have survived this tale, he thought. He knew many a brave souls who've tried and failed. Daryl from accounting, Regina from HR, all good people that succumbed to the man and became slaves to capitalism. Badger would no longer fall for his dark magic. Everything he just experienced, the destruction of the planet, prepared him for this fight. He remembered Pete's demise. Looking back now, it wasn't Badger that killed Pete. It was the crippling debt of running a failing bar that did him in. Towers couldn't solve murders because he was an idiot. It was because he had to work a 9 to 5. In Hadrian, he ran a pirate ship, for God's sake, the ultimate capitalistic endeavor. His friends all gone, and Badger would make sure he would not be the next. Badger Stevens arrived at the insurance building. It was dark. The moon lit up the property, giving it an eerie feel. Stevens walked in the front door and was greeted by Earl, the old security guard. Seeing no threat, Earl led Badger up the top floor. When he entered, the room was bathed in neon light. The cubicles were filled with mindless drones doing their job. None noticed he had entered. At the far end of the room was the office of Winston, his supervisor. Badger made his way down the aisle, daggers drawn, at the ready for anything that might jump out at him. As he approached the door, the sound of the clicking on keyboards stopped. He turned around to find all the drones standing up facing the office, their eyes hidden behind their thick glasses, each with a mug of coffee in hand. One by one, each drone began pouring the boiling hot coffee in their face and smiling. Badger entered the office with confusion. At the desk was Winston, working away on the company reports. "Old man Stevens, come in. What a pleasant surprise." "Cut the crap, Winston. I know it was you. You're behind all of this." "Why, whatever do you mean, old man Stevens? I knew it was you and your capitalistic drones. You caused everything." "What do you mean, my capitalistic drones?" Winston replied. At that moment, Badger jumped back. He was the one sitting behind the desk, wearing the same black glasses, black tie, black shirt, and holding the same mug of coffee. On his right pocket was the name tag, which read Badger Stevens, Senior VP of Sales. At the other end of the table, Winston, with a devilish grin on his face. "You see, Mr. Stevens, we, capitalists, don't take kindly to threats. We are everywhere and nowhere at the same time. We end wars only to create wars. We write books like your trusty Book of the Dead only to sell books. We build ships and bars and abduct violent babies and become our trusted warriors throughout time. We even open cosmic diners in order to have a product in the after." Badger jumped from his desk and cowered against the wall. No, no, no. This isn't possible. This is dark magic. Give in, Badger. You are our greatest creation. You are head of sales. Badger leaped at Winston only to pass through him and collide with the office door. "Do you think it would be that easy? I am you, Stevens. I am you." Badger looked down at his hands, touched his face. His mind was racing, for in the reflection of the computer screen, looking back at him was none other than Winston himself. The entity began laughing hysterically. No, 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 no. This isn't happening. This can't be happening," Badger yelled. Badger smashed his head against the computer screen, breaking it into pieces. Once again, Winston appeared at the door entrance. "Face it, old man Stevens, there is no escaping capitalism. You can never escape us." Maybe he was right, Badger thought. There was no defeating an entity such as this. In all his life, he had never faced something as twisted and tormented as capitalism. Nothing came close. "There has to be a way," Badger said. "There is no way, Stevens. Many have tried, but all have failed. No, I will not accept that. I'm Badger Stevens, the greatest warrior alive, and I call upon the strength of the owl." "Whoo!" Badger called. But nothing happened. No armor appeared, no golden gauntlets made of dragon scale, nothing. "That won't save you here," Winston said. "You're a part of capitalism now, Badger. You are a part of the Horde." How had he become so reckless in his quest for vengeance? The evil was right in front of him this whole time, yet in his stupidity he failed to see the truth. He had become part of the horde now, a mindless drone fueling the capitalistic society. No matter how hard he fought, Badger Stevens couldn't win. Bashing his head against the desk, he would always find himself filling out expense reports like he was trapped in a time loop. After about 7 or 8 coffees, Badger would look at his reflection in the computer screen. Capitalism was sucking the life force from him. He had bags under his eyes, wrinkly skin, and his hands shook. The minute he would snap out of it, he was back to his youth. Bashing his head, the loop would reset. He even looked at his driver's license. It too matched the image, the reflection on the 24-inch monitor. His mind was slowly descending into chaos. The lunch bell rang. An old man Stevens stood and walked to the lunchroom. There he had his quail eggs, his dry toast, his gallon of water. This was Badger Stevens' life now. But he knew there had to be a way to escape the clutches of Winston and the capitalistic horde. There was one way. What if I quit my job? Badger said. Break free from the capitalistic society. Suddenly, Winston seemed to appear out of thin air. Quit your job? Do you see how good your 401k is, Badger? You would be a fool. Winston was right. The benefits of sales job were indeed sublime. That wasn't the way, especially with rising interest rates and a recession on the horizon. Snap out of it, Badger yelled. Instantly, he was back at his former self, still chained to the desk by a 1994 mouse cord. I thought we almost had you there, old man Stevens, Winston said with a laugh. We will break you. In time, we will break you. You demon. You sack of shit. Badger, that is not the proper workplace language. I'm going to report you to HR and have to dock you a vacation day. No, Badger yelled. Not a vacation day. I have plans to head to Mexico. Again, he snapped out of the clutches of the horde. The weight of capitalism was weighing down on Badger. He could feel the mouse cord tighten around his wrist. The black necktie got tighter around his neck. He could no longer see without the black framed glasses, but most of all, he started chatting around the water cooler. Why are you doing this? Badger yelled. Why? Capitalism has been the only way, Badger. We created the galaxy, the planets, textbooks. We fabricated the moon landing. Republicans and Democrats, avian flu, hell, even COVID was us. If capitalism deems it so, then it shall be. There is no greater power than us, and there will never be anything after us. Capitalism rules all, and the sooner you get that through your thick fucking skull, the better you shall be. Maybe Winston was right. Maybe there was no saving the great Badger Stevens. But he had to fight it. The ultimate death was a glorious death, and there was no enemy Badger ever faced that didn't die by his wicked hands. He snapped out of the trance once again and began yanking at the mouse cord. Badger tugged and tugged. The computer monitor inched closer and closer to him. His eyes began to gloss over. The sound of the horde was growing in his mind. His mind was turning into mush. He yanked inch by inch, fighting through the noise. With one final tug, the monitor came crashing down, freeing his right arm. His eyes returned to normal, and he looked around to see if anyone heard. One down, one to go, Badger said. The tower fell easier than the monitor, freeing Badger's other hand. He rose quickly from his cubicle to make sure none of the drones were disturbed. Luckily enough, none of them were. Pulling out his daggers, he crept in and out of each cubicle like a demon's whisper, cutting the throats of each drone. The odd thing was, instead of blood, each member of capitalism leaked only circuit wires, oil, and a sea of pennies. In and out he went for what felt like hours. One by one, drone after drone died by his hands. It had to have been 75, 80 drones all slain over the course of hours. When the last body was accounted for, Badger slowly made his way to Winston's office, but before he could reach the doorknob, the elevator door clicked open. Badger turned around to see a swarm of drones enter and fill each cubicle, tossing the bodies in the aisle. The horde was indeed plentiful. There was no way this would be an easy task. He had been foolish yet again to think he could defeat the horde with physical strength. Badger stood up and walked calmly back to his cubicle. He had to think, what do capitalists hate the most? Perhaps sucking on the government's dick? No, that was easily fixable by government contracts. Think, you wise fool, think, he said to himself. Badger plugged in his hardware once more and logged into his profile. He felt defeated, lost, and useless. Never had he faced an enemy so powerful. Maybe Winston was right. Maybe capitalism could not be defeated. The lunch bell rang, and Badger followed all the workers to the lunchroom. He sat eating his quail eggs and drinking his gallon of water when he overheard something. The drones were speaking some type of coded language, but Badger understood many languages, and this one was no different. But it dawned on him. Capitalism could not be defeated by any single warrior. The only thing powerful enough to defeat capitalism was the entity itself. In that instant, Badger knew what he had to do. After his lunch, he returned to his cubicle with a wide grin. He typed away on his reports and did his work. When he was finished, he gathered up all his paperwork and walked over to Winston's office. He knocked on the door. "Come in." "Badger, good to see you. Are those the reports? I knew you would finally catch on." "Winston, old friend, here they are, filled and ready for processing." Badger handed over the stack of papers and sat down at Winston's desk. "Winston, I really admire the work we do here," Badger said. "Well, capitalism rules all, Badger. I'm glad you're finally figuring that out. It took me a while, but you're right, it does. Is there anything else I can help you with?" "No, that will be all," Badger said with a smile. Badger stood and walked to the door. "Actually, there is one more thing, Winston." "What's that, Badger?" Badger turned around and with a sad look on his face. "I'd like to report," Badger paused. "I'd like to report a sexual harassment claim." Winston stood up quickly and raised his hand, pointing at Badger. How? Winston froze. His body began glitching like a computer malfunction. "What's happening?" Winston said. "What have you done?" "What, me?" Badger said. "Nothing, just filing a report." Winston began glitching more sporadically. "Oh, and I think I heard some union talk from the drone in Cubicle 9. "What?" Winston yelled. "Union talk." Winston began turning a pale gray. His glitching continued until he fell to the floor in a pile of wire, black oil, and pennies. Winston's lifeless corpse, wire, oil, and pennies exposed, continued to twitch and glitch even after Badger walked out of the room. Instead of killing each drone one by one, he found a tank of gasoline in a broom closet and torched the building. As Badger Stevens watched the building burn, hearing the zombie-like screams of the horde as they burned to death, he was grateful. He had defeated capitalism. Badger truly was the greatest warrior in the galaxy. Badger knew not even capitalism could survive claims to HR. It has and always will be capitalism's Achilles heel. Badger began walking home. On his way, he passed a number of homeless people but resisted the urge to slaughter them in cold blood. He passed by the war-torn and destroyed remains of the Thirsty Owl. Walking through the rubble, he found the body of Little Pete, the charred, almost unrecognizable corpse of Knox Paddington. Off in the corner was the deformed remains of Detective H.S. Towers. "That poor son of a bitch," Badger said. Badger gathered up all three bodies, threw them in a pile, and said a few words. He then poured out a little vodka he found laying around and lit the pile on fire. Flames casted a silhouette on Badger's face as he watched the remains of his favorite watering hole dissolve into ash. By the time he arrived home, it was almost midnight. His house was also in shambles after his deadly battle with Towers. The Book of the Dead lay tossed off to the side, and the bloodstains riddled his house. Badger walked over and picked up the book, dusted it off, and put it back on the bookshelf. What was there to do now? The greatest warrior just defeated the greatest enemy. Badger removed his clothes, laid out his daggers, took a shower, got into a fresh set of PJs, and went to bed. At 7 a.m., he woke up to the rising sun. He got up, put on his clothes, hopped in his Tesla, and headed to work. He was running a bit late when he entered the office. Winston said not to worry. Badger Stevens snapped out of the dream. He was still tethered to the computer. Everything was simply a fabrication of his mind succumbing to capitalism. He screamed in agony. Winston strolled over. "You think a little HR complaint could get rid of us that quickly, Badger? You fool," Winston laughed. "You son of a bitch. Now, Badger, the sooner you join us, the sooner this will be over. We are the Horde." Badger was tired of fighting. He had no clue how long he had been battling capitalism. His mind was weakening, and the days blended into weeks and months. Looking in the screen reflection, he was beginning to turn into Old Man Stevens again. Only this time, when he shook his head, he couldn't snap out of it. The horde was winning. He could feel the blood of capitalism flowing through his veins. His eyes were beginning to fill with the little dollar signs, and he was starting to say things like equity and crypto mining. The battle was slowly coming to an end. The great Badger Stevens, slayer of the homeless, harbinger of chaos, was dying. He was falling victim to capitalism, much like everyone else does. He could see the light dwindling from his eyes. His strength was slowly fading. Hovering next to him like some demented ghoul was Winston. He was salivating, watching as the life slowly drained from Badger. Yes, 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 follow us, Badger Stevens, Winston said. Become one of the horde. As the crippling weight of capitalism began to sink in, all Badger could do was wait. He waited, eyes closed, tethered to this desk. He was an old man, full of regret, never having found love, curing the world of homelessness, plague, or even eating a McRib. Now he would become part of capitalism, but everyone does at some point, right? Maybe this wouldn't be so bad, Badger said. Finally, Badger gave in. He relaxed his body and opened his soul to the horde. Winston, finally seeing the opening, seized the opportunity. Like a dirty leech, he attached himself to the spinal cord of Badger Stevens once and for all, merging with him, becoming the capitalistic horde. For the first couple of months, Old Man Stevens had a hard time adjusting to his new life. He hated working long hours, hated having to take lunch breaks with the rest of the mindless drones, but most of all, he hated Winston. But after a while, things got better. He received 25 vacation days, a reasonable 401k package, and his salary was enough to open a small business. He started a small construction company, their first job rebuilding the Thirsty Owl. The one thing Badger missed, however, was adventure. He could remember bits and pieces from his old life, but never enough to form a complete thought. Everything seemed false and fictional. Had he really fought ghosts and sailed the cosmic sea? Was he really an immortal being with a taste for bloodshed? There was no way of ever truly knowing. The Horde made sure of that. All Badger Stevens could do was wonder where an 83-year-old man got his scars. Where had he gotten his daggers, which remained in a wooden box on his nightstand? Once the Thirsty Owl was rebuilt, Badger put it up for sale, and it was purchased by one Pete Little the Fourth. He said he was a traveler from a faraway place and wanted to learn the art of mixology. Badger didn't care. He just wanted a place to sip cold beer and forget about his job. Exactly 5 years since the second death of Hadrian the Black, the rise and fall of Little Pete, and Badger's defeat at the hands of capitalism, the Thirsty Owl was reopened. When Badger walked in, the place seemed familiar. Even the chubby bartender seemed in place. He ordered a cold beer and a shot of whiskey. A lot to drink for an old-timer like yourself, said Pete. Shut up and just pour the beer, old man, Stevens said. You're the boss. Damn right I am, Badger said. After his 10th shot, he looked at Pete and asked him a question. What does a man do if he wants to change careers, Pete? I suppose something drastic, sir. Drastic like what? I don't know really, but I suppose enough to bring attention to the issue. Badger thought. Maybe I knew something. Thanks for the drinks, Pete. See you tomorrow. I hope not, sir. Badger looked back before he exited the bar. Pete looked at him with a smile and winked. That's odd, Badger said. It was late at night when Badger instantly woke from a deep sleep. His mind was racing. He had found the answer. He knew what he had to do. The answer to all his problems was right in front of him. How could he be so foolish? He couldn't sleep, but knew he had to get his day started. By Tuesday, his plans would be executed and he would be free from his curse. Desperation was setting in. Old Man Stevens knew this was his last shot. If this plan failed, he would forever be an insurance salesman. Perhaps a little of Badger Stevens was leaking through the void. Perhaps the old man wasn't crazy as many expected him to be. Driving his Tesla, Old Man Stevens pulled into an outdoor shop. Not a literal shop outdoors, but the kind that sold all types of gear for those that liked to live off the grid. The gear he would need was inside. He would need one key item and thousands of little ones. Surprisingly, he was allowed to purchase them with ease. He loaded up his gear and headed back to his home. Old Man Stevens thought back to the Thirsty Owl. He thought how everything felt in its place. His conversation with Pete, the bar, hating his job, there was a familiarity about it, something he had felt before. He pulled into his driveway and went inside. Old Man Stevens grabbed the box with his daggers, opened it, and upon touching the daggers was greeted with a host of memories from a life never lived. He had flashes of Hadrian, the call of the owl, Knox Paddington killing towers, fighting Winston, and finally succumbing to capitalistic horde. He grabbed the daggers and tucked them inside his waistband and raced back to his car. Arriving at his building, Old Man Stevens knew what needed to be done. This was the only way he could free himself from working as a salesman. This was his career change. He thought long and hard about it before exiting his Tesla. This is the only way, he said. He opened his truck and loaded the brand spanking new AR-15. The wood chipper, the meat grinder, the tree chopper. The guy at the front counter said this thing could mow down a forest if you were dedicated enough. That's exactly what Old Man Stevens needed. He needed something that would change minds and make people ask questions. He grabbed the gun and the loads of ammunition and entered his workplace. Before long, the sounds of slaughter could be heard a mile away. With a crazed look on his eyes, Old Man Stevens, rumored to be 89 years old, began to mow down the drones and everyone inside the building. He blasted from floor to floor, spraying everybody. With each shot, a part of Badger Stevens' return. Finally, he arrived at Winston's office. Badger kicked the door open, but before Winston could say anything, Badgers unloaded an entire clip inside him. Winston did not move. He did not glitch. There was no oil, no wire, no pennies that escaped his body. Badger Stevens stood over his body in a frantic state. I beat you, Badgers yelled. I defeated capitalism. I won. I truly am the greatest warrior on this planet. Badger began laughing. He laughed and laughed and laughed, right up until the Oklahoma police forced him to the ground. They subdued him with ease. He was, after all, 89 years old. Eventually, Old Man Stevens would be tossed into a padded cell due to his frantic ramblings. How could he not? All he talked about was being an immortal pirate, fighting the galaxy with owl-like powers, killing a detective that was missing for 5 years, and confessing to being the Canaryville Ripper. In the end, Old Man Stevens laughed his way into existence. He was tossed into that cell, and the key was never even made for a lock. Badger Stevens would go down as one of the most insane individuals of the 21st century until the day that Pete came walking up to his cell. Confusion was setting in when the guard approached the cell of Badger Stevens. You have a visitor, he said. It's your son, Peter. Badger didn't know how he got to the cell, let alone how long he had been there, and he certainly didn't know he had a son. It's been a long time, Dad, Peter said. Who are you? Badgers replied. Here we go again. It's me, Peter, your son. I have no son. You're really going to do this again? Jesus Christ, you shot up a business this time? I can't believe they are even letting me see you. Badger squinted, but the look in his eyes told Peter everything he needed to know. You really don't remember me, do you? Badger Stevens, 89 years old. You own a failing bar, the Thirsty Owl. You have a son, me, Peter Stevens. You met Mom in a dirty diner when she was homeless, and you hated those people ever since. Since I can remember, you went into those spurts where you would disappear for months pretending to be some adventurer. Then you would show up depressed, take some random job, and things would go back to normal. Then a couple of drinks, and you would talk about a career change, leaving me to run the bar. You could see the gears turning in Badger's mind, but nothing was sticking. I'm Badger Stevens, immortal warrior, pirate of the cosmic sea, Peter said, finishing his sentence. I've heard it all before, Peter said, but this time was different. Badger was in a maximum security prison. He had slaughtered 94 employees with a semi-automatic rifle. The chances of him overlapping were slim to none. What have you done this time? Peter said. No prison can hold me. When the guard sleeps, I'll snap his neck and slip out of here, undetected, Badger said. Peter was devastated. His heart was heavy. His mind was even more fractured. How can you not remember anything? He said. What about your drinking buddy, Paddington, and his husband, Hadrian? Do you remember them? Hadrian, the pirate scum. He's dead. I killed him with my own daggers. You mean your war-issued army daggers, Peter said. And what about your therapist, Mr. Towers? He said you stopped seeing him. You mean Detective Towers? I gave that fool the slip, Badger said. All Peter could do was sigh. He pulled a mirror out of his pocket and faced it at Badger Stevens. The reflection was that of an old man full of regret, a veteran sick with self-doubt. But to Badger, he saw the immortal being that saved the world from capitalistic evil. I think this might be the last time we speak, Peter said. Nonsense. The Order of Pete will always be at my beckoning call, Badger said. Here, call me if you need to. This is my card. Badger grabbed the slip of paper and tossed it aside. Goodbye, Father, Pete said. As Peter walked off, Badger retreated back into his bed. He knew he needed to plan his escape come nightfall. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw 2 words printed on the back of the card that made him leap to the front of the cell and shout. At the end of the hallway, Peter turned around and ripped off the flesh mask he was wearing, revealing the charred remains of Winston, whom looked more like a possessed ghoul. We win, Badger Stevens. The Horde always wins.
The Television.